I was minding my own business in my driveway at 7 in the morning when Patricia Hendricks plowed her white Lexus SUV straight into the rear bumper of my Ford F-150, sending my coffee mug flying into the grass and nearly giving me a heart attack. The screech of metal on metal echoed through our quiet Riverside, California neighborhood, and for a moment I just stood there in shock, watching steam rise from her crumpled hood while my truck's tailgate hung at an awkward angle. "Are you kidding me right now?" I shouted, dropping the garden hose I'd been using to rinse off my truck. The water kept running, creating a small river that flowed down my driveway toward the street. Patricia emerged from her vehicle like nothing had happened, smoothing down her khaki caprice and adjusting her oversized sunglasses. She was the vice president of our Homeowners Association, a position she wielded like a weapon against anyone who dared to plant the wrong color flowers or leave their trash cans out 5 minutes too long. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled despite the collision, and she carried her ever-present clipboard like a shield. "Jason Hartley, we need to discuss your truck," she said, completely ignoring the fact that she just rear-ended me in my own driveway. "Discuss my truck. You just crashed into it." I gestured at the obvious damage, my hands shaking from adrenaline. My beautiful truck, which I'd saved for 3 years to buy, now had a mangled bumper and what looked like a broken taillight. "That's beside the point," Patricia said, making notes on her clipboard. "I've been documenting violations in the neighborhood this morning, and your vehicle has been parked on your driveway for the past 48 hours without proper warning reflectors. According to HOA bylaws section 12.7, any vehicle parked in a visible location for more than 24 hours must display appropriate safety equipment." I blinked at her, genuinely wondering if I was still asleep, and this was some kind of bizarre nightmare. "Patricia, you crashed into my truck, in my driveway, while I was washing it, and you're talking about reflectors. The accident occurred because your truck was inadequately marked," she continued, her tone suggesting this was the most reasonable statement in the world. "If you'd had proper reflectors, I would have seen it more clearly. It's bright red. It's 7 in the morning and the sun is up. How could you possibly not see a red truck in broad daylight?" My voice was getting louder now, and I noticed a few neighbors peeking out their windows. Mrs. Chen from across the street had come out onto her porch, pretending to water plants that clearly didn't need watering. Patricia pursed her lips. "I'll be filing a report with the HOA board. Expect correspondence regarding the violation and subsequent damages. Good day, Mr. Hartley." She turned to leave, apparently intending to just drive away in her smoking Lexus. "Oh no you don't," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling the police. You just hit my vehicle and you're trying to leave the scene. That's a crime, Patricia." Her face flushed red, clashing with her coral lipstick. "Don't you threaten me. I have every right to document violations and I will not be intimidated by aggressive homeowners." "I'm not being aggressive, I'm being hit." I dialed 911 while she sputtered indignantly. The operator answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could while Patricia stood there, now photographing my truck from multiple angles with her phone. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. In the 3 years I'd lived in Riverside Meadows, Patricia had been a constant thorn in everyone's side, but this was next level even for her. Officer Marcus Webb arrived about 15 minutes later, stepping out of his patrol car with the weary expression of someone who'd dealt with HOA disputes before. He was in his mid-40s with graying temples and the patient demeanor of a kindergarten teacher. "All right, folks, what's going on here?" he asked, surveying the scene. The damage was obvious even at a glance. "Officer, thank goodness," Patricia said, rushing toward him. This man's vehicle was parked illegally without proper safety equipment, and when I was conducting my morning inspection rounds, the inadequate visibility caused me to accidentally make contact with his bumper. "She plowed into my parked truck in my own driveway," I said flatly. "I was standing right here washing it when she hit it." Officer Webb walked around both vehicles, making notes. He examined the point of impact, the position of my truck in the driveway, and Patricia's Lexus, which had clearly sustained front-end damage consistent with rear-ending another vehicle. "Madam, your vehicle struck his truck from behind while it was stationary in a private driveway," he asked Patricia. "The vehicle was improperly marked," she insisted. "HOA regulations clearly state, HOA regulations don't supersede traffic law," Officer Webb interrupted gently. "Madam, you're clearly at fault here. This is private property, the vehicle was parked and you rear-ended it. I'm going to need both your insurance information and your driver's licenses." I handed over my documents while Patricia fumbled through her designer handbag, her expression growing increasingly sour. "This is absolutely ridiculous. I serve this community. I've been documenting violations since 6 this morning to keep our neighborhood standards high." "That's very dedicated," Officer Webb said diplomatically, "but it doesn't change the fact that you hit a parked vehicle. Were you perhaps distracted while driving?" "I was focused on my duties," Patricia said defensively. "So you were looking at properties instead of watching where you were driving?" the officer pressed. Patricia's silence was telling. Officer Webb finished writing up the accident report and issued her a citation for careless driving. He handed us both copies of the report and advised us to contact our insurance companies. "This isn't over," Patricia said to me as Officer Webb walked back to his patrol car. "You still violated HOA regulations, and there will be consequences." "Bring it on," I said, exhausted by the entire interaction. It was only 7:30 in the morning and my day was already completely derailed. After Patricia drove away in her damaged Lexus, leaving a trail of coolant down the street, I called my insurance company and my boss to explain why I'd be late to work. I was a project manager for a construction company, and we had a big meeting scheduled for 9. My supervisor, thankfully, was understanding when I explained that someone had crashed into my truck in my driveway. The insurance claims process was predictably tedious. I spent nearly an hour on the phone, explaining the situation multiple times to different representatives. They confirmed they'd received the police report and that Patricia's insurance would likely be covering the damages since she was clearly at fault. The adjuster said someone would come out within 2 days to assess the damage. I managed to make it to work by 10, driving my truck despite the damage since it was still operational. My coworker Daniel took one look at the mangled bumper and let out a low whistle. "What happened to your truck, man?" "HOA board member rear-ended me in my driveway this morning," I said, grabbing my laptop bag from the passenger seat. "You're joking." "I wish I was. Then she tried to blame me for not having reflectors on my truck." Daniel laughed, then realized I was serious. "Wait, really? That's insane." Welcome to Riverside Meadows, where the HOA is run by people who have never heard of logic or personal responsibility, I muttered. The work day dragged on, my mind constantly wandering back to the morning's incident. I kept expecting my phone to ring with more insurance questions, or perhaps Patricia calling to apologize. Neither happened. What did happen was an email notification at 3 in the afternoon from the Riverside Meadows HOA official account. The subject line read, "Notice of Violation and Damages Assessment." I opened it with a sense of dread that proved entirely justified. The email signed by Patricia Hendricks in her capacity as HOA Vice President, formally accused me of violating Section 12.7 of the Community Bylaws by parking a vehicle without proper warning reflectors for an extended period. It went on to state that this violation had directly contributed to property damage, specifically the damage to her vehicle when she unavoidably made contact with my truck during her routine inspection rounds. The email concluded with a bill for $2,347, representing her insurance deductible, plus administrative fees for processing the violation complaint. I was given 10 days to pay or face additional penalties, including possible legal action and a lien on my property. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little higher. This woman had crashed into my truck, gotten a police citation for it, and was now trying to bill me for her deductible plus made-up fees. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. I immediately forwarded the email to my insurance company and called them back. The representative, a tired-sounding woman named Barbara, listened to my explanation with increasing disbelief. "So let me get this straight," Barbara said. "The at-fault party is now trying to charge you for damages to her vehicle, claiming HOA violations." "That's exactly what's happening," I confirmed. "Mr. Hartley, I've been doing this job for 17 years and I've never heard anything quite this absurd. Don't worry, we'll handle this. Forward any communication from her or the HOA to us immediately. Do not pay anything. Her insurance will be covering your damages, and she has absolutely no grounds to charge you anything." That was somewhat reassuring, but I knew Patricia well enough to know she wouldn't let this go easily. She'd been on the HOA board for 8 years, according to neighborhood gossip, and had developed a reputation for being relentless when she thought she was right. Logic and facts rarely seemed to enter into her decision-making process. I decided to do some research into the actual HOA bylaws when I got home that evening. I'd received a copy when I bought the house, but like most people, I'd barely glanced at them. They were sitting in a filing cabinet in my spare bedroom, gathering dust along with old tax returns and the warranty information for appliances I no longer owned. It took me 20 minutes to find the binder, which was buried under a stack of old university textbooks I kept meaning to donate. I flipped through the pages until I found Section 12.7, which Patricia had cited in her email. The actual text read, "Recreational vehicles, boats, trailers, and commercial vehicles parked in visible locations for extended periods should be equipped with appropriate safety equipment, as determined by local traffic regulations to ensure neighborhood safety and aesthetics." There was nothing about standard passenger vehicles or pickup trucks, nothing about warning reflectors. The section was clearly intended for RVs and work trucks with commercial signage, the kind of vehicles that HOAs typically try to keep out of sight. My Ford F-150 was just a regular pickup truck that I used for personal transportation and the occasional hardware store run. Patricia had either deliberately misinterpreted the rule or simply made up the requirement entirely. Either way, she was blatantly in the wrong, which gave me a small sense of vindication even though the situation was still deeply frustrating. I drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing the actual text of the bylaw and pointing out that my vehicle didn't fall under its purview. I also attached the police report clearly showing Patricia at fault for the accident. I kept my tone professional and factual, though what I really wanted to write would have required far more profanity than was appropriate for official correspondence. Before sending it, I called my friend Marcus Chen, who lived across the street with his wife Lisa. Marcus was an attorney, though he specialized in corporate law rather than HOA disputes. Still, he knew more about legal issues than I did. "Jason, my man, Lisa told me about the crash this morning," Marcus said when he answered. "That was absolutely wild to watch. Patricia just drove straight into your truck like she didn't even see it." "That's because she was too busy inspecting everyone's yards for violations instead of watching the road," I said. "But listen, it gets worse." I filled him in on the email and the attempted billing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the HOA governing documents handy?" "Right in front of me. I already checked the section she cited. It doesn't apply to regular vehicles. Send me everything." The police report, the email, photos of the damage, and a scan of the relevant bylaw sections. I want to look at this properly. I spent the next hour photographing and scanning documents, then emailed everything to Marcus. While I waited for his response, I made myself dinner, a hastily assembled sandwich that I ate while standing at the kitchen counter. My mind was too occupied to focus on anything else. Marcus called me back around 8 o'clock. "Okay, I've reviewed everything. Patricia doesn't have a leg to stand on legally. The bylaw is clear. Your vehicle isn't covered by that section. Furthermore, she was cited by police for the accident, establishing fault. Her attempt to charge you is baseless and could potentially be considered harassment or fraud. So what do I do? Send your response to the HOA, but also send a copy directly to the HOA president." "Who is that right now?" "Stephen Matthews. He's actually pretty reasonable compared to Patricia." "Good. Send it to him with a cover note expressing your concerns about Patricia's conduct. Be professional but firm. You might also want to attend the next HOA board meeting and address this publicly." The thought of going to an HOA meeting made me want to fake my own death and move to another country, but Marcus had a point. If Patricia was willing to pull something this blatant with me, she'd probably done similar things to other homeowners. This needed to be addressed formally. I sent my response that night, copying Stephen Matthews and the general HOA board email address. In my cover note to Stephen, I expressed serious concerns about Patricia misrepresenting HOA bylaws and attempting to extort money from me after causing an accident. I kept it factual and professional, letting the documentation speak for itself. 2 days passed with no response from the HOA. The insurance adjuster came out, took photos of my truck, and confirmed what I already knew. The damage would cost about $3,500 to repair properly. Patricia's insurance had already accepted liability, so my out-of-pocket costs would be minimal. I'd have to pay my deductible initially, but it would be reimbursed once everything was processed. On the 3rd day, I received an email from Stephen Matthews requesting a meeting. He suggested we meet at a local coffee shop rather than at anyone's home, which seemed like a smart, neutral choice. We scheduled it for Saturday morning at 9. Stephen was in his late 50s, a retired accountant who'd moved to Riverside Meadows about 10 years ago. He'd been HOA president for the past 2 years, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. He was generally well-liked in the neighborhood for being pragmatic and not overly obsessed with minor rule violations. How he and Patricia managed to work together on the board was a mystery to everyone. I arrived at the Riverside Coffee House a few minutes early and ordered a large black coffee. The place was busy with the usual Saturday morning crowd: families with kids, college students studying, and retirees reading newspapers. Stephen walked in right at 9, spotted me at a corner table and waved. "Jason, thanks for meeting with me," he said, sitting down after getting his own coffee. He looked tired with dark circles under his eyes. "I'm going to be direct with you. Patricia is claiming you're harassing her and making false accusations to undermine her authority as vice president. I took a long sip of coffee before responding. "Stephen, she crashed into my parked truck and then tried to bill me for her damages. Everything I've said is documented in the police report. I know. I read everything you sent." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through what I assumed were my emails. "I also called Patricia's insurance company to verify the claim details. You're right about everything. The accident was her fault. The bylaw doesn't apply to your vehicle, and her attempt to charge you was completely inappropriate." "So why are we meeting?" Stephen sighed heavily. "Because Patricia is threatening to sue both you and the HOA if we don't support her position. She's claiming that the stress of the situation has caused her emotional distress and that she's being victimized. She's playing the victim after rear-ending my truck and trying to extort money from me." "Welcome to my world," Stephen said dryly. "Jason, between you and me, Patricia has been a problem for a while now. She's rigid. She interprets rules in whatever way suits her agenda, and she's alienated half the neighborhood. But she's also very litigious. 3 years ago, she sued a neighbor over a fence height dispute. She lost, but it cost that family thousands in legal fees. Most people find it easier to just go along with whatever she wants rather than fight her." "I'm not most people," I said. "She damaged my property and is now trying to make me pay for it. If she wants to sue me, fine. I've got documentation, witnesses, and a police report. Let her waste her money." Stephen looked at me with something like relief. "I was hoping you'd say that. Look, the board meeting is next Thursday at 7 p.m. I want you there to present your case formally. I'm going to recommend we remove Patricia from the board for misuse of her position and harassment of a homeowner." "You can do that, according to our bylaws, yes. It requires a majority vote from the board, which is 5 people total. I've already spoken quietly with 2 other members who are fed up with Patricia's behavior. Your situation might be the catalyst we need to actually do something about her." We talked for another 30 minutes, going over the details of what would happen at the meeting. Stephen advised me to prepare a brief statement and bring copies of all my documentation. He also suggested I might want to invite any neighbors who'd had issues with Patricia to attend as well, since HOA meetings were open to all residents. That afternoon, I walked around the neighborhood talking to people I knew. It didn't take long to find others who'd been on the receiving end of Patricia's overzealous enforcement. Mrs. Chen had been threatened with fines because her roses grew slightly over the approved height for flower beds. The Peterson family had received violation notices because their 6-year-old son left his bike in the front yard. Tim Bradley, who lived 2 streets over, had been issued a citation for parking his hybrid sedan in his driveway because Patricia claimed it looked commercial due to its gray paint job. By the end of the day, I had 7 neighbors who were willing to attend the meeting and speak about their experiences. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation, but most were simply tired of walking on eggshells in their own neighborhood. The next few days passed in a blur of work and preparation. I typed up a statement, organized my documents, and made copies of everything. My insurance company confirmed that Patricia's insurer had accepted full liability and that repairs to my truck could begin the following week. Patricia's attempt to bill me had been forwarded to her insurance company, who'd apparently sent her a strongly worded letter about making fraudulent claims. Thursday evening arrived faster than I'd expected. I put on business casual clothes, slacks, and a button-down shirt, and gathered my materials into a folder. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a modest building near the neighborhood entrance that hosted everything from children's birthday parties to yoga classes. I arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already half full. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members would sit. Stephen was there setting up, arranging name placards and organizing papers. He gave me a slight nod when I walked in. Patricia arrived precisely at 7, dressed in a blazer and skirt like she was heading to court. She saw me and her expression hardened, but she didn't say anything. She took her seat at the board table, pointedly ignoring the empty chair beside Stephen where her name placard sat. The room filled up quickly. I counted at least 30 residents, far more than usually attended these meetings according to Stephen. Word had apparently spread about the confrontation to come. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row. The Petersons were there with their son. Tim Bradley gave me a thumbs up from across the room. Stephen called the meeting to order at 7 on the dot. Good evening, everyone. We have a larger than usual attendance tonight. Before we begin regular business, we have a serious matter to address regarding board conduct and homeowner complaints. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Stephen continued, Jason Hartley has brought a formal complaint against Vice President Patricia Hendricks regarding an incident that occurred 8 days ago. Jason, would you please present your statement? I stood up, my folder in hand, and walked to the front of the room. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady as I recounted the events. The accident, Patricia's immediate attempt to blame me, the citation she received from police, and her subsequent email trying to bill me for damages plus fees. I have copies of the police report, the HOA bylaw section Patricia cited, photos of the damage and the email she sent, I said, holding up the folder. All of this documentation proves that Patricia was at fault for the accident, misrepresented HOA rules to justify her actions, and attempted to inappropriately charge me for damages she caused. I distributed copies to the board members while murmurs rippled through the audience. Patricia's face had gone red. This is character assassination, she said loudly. Jason is clearly trying to avoid responsibility for his own negligence. His truck was parked without proper safety equipment, creating a hazard. In my own driveway, I said calmly, where I was actively washing it when you hit it. The bylaws clearly state the bylaws refer to recreational vehicles and commercial trucks, Stephen interrupted, reading from the copy I'd provided. Not standard passenger vehicles. Patricia, you know this. You've been on the board for 8 years. The spirit of the rule is irrelevant when you're trying to charge a homeowner for damages you caused. Another board member interjected. This was Donald Rice, a retired engineer who'd always struck me as no nonsense. I've reviewed the documentation Jason provided. There's no ambiguity here. You hit his parked truck, got cited by police, and then tried to make him pay your deductible. That's not enforcement, that's harassment. I second that assessment, said Margaret Flynn, the third board member. She was a school teacher in her 40s with a reputation for fairness. I've been concerned about several of Patricia's recent enforcement actions. They seem motivated more by personal grievances than actual rule violations. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a witch hunt. I have served this community faithfully for years, maintaining standards that keep our property values high. I will not sit here and be attacked by someone who clearly has no respect for neighborhood regulations. Sit down, Patricia, Stephen said firmly. We're not done. I most certainly will not. This meeting is a farce, and I will be consulting my attorney about this hostile work environment. You're a volunteer board member, not an employee, Donald pointed out. There is no work environment. I'm leaving, Patricia announced. And I'll be filing complaints with the state HOA oversight board about this kangaroo court. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, heels clicking loudly on the linoleum floor. The room was silent as she left, the door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. Stephen exhaled slowly. Well, that could have gone better. Jason, thank you for bringing this to our attention formally. Does anyone else have experiences they'd like to share regarding Patricia's conduct as vice president? What followed was nearly an hour of residents standing up to recount their own run-ins with Patricia. The stories ranged from petty to absurd. Violation notices for garden gnomes, threats of fines for having the wrong shade of beige paint on a front door, complaints about children playing outside making too much noise. One elderly couple had received a citation for their American flag being 2 inches larger than the recommended size, according to Patricia's interpretation of the bylaws. The board members listened to everything, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. I could see Stephen becoming increasingly frustrated as the stories piled up. When the last person finished speaking, he looked at his fellow board members. I think we have sufficient cause to call for a vote on removing Patricia Hendricks from her position as vice president and from the board entirely, Stephen said. All in favor. 4 hands went up immediately. The 5th board member, an older man named Walter who'd been mostly silent, hesitated before raising his hand as well. The motion passes unanimously, Stephen announced. Patricia Hendricks is removed from the Riverside Meadows HOA board effective immediately. We'll need to hold an election for her replacement next month. The room erupted in applause. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, though I suspected this wouldn't be the end of Patricia's crusade. Stephen adjourned the meeting shortly after, and several neighbors came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. Mrs. Chen hugged me, which was unexpected but touching. Tim Bradley offered to buy me a beer sometime, which I accepted. As I walked to my truck, Stephen caught up with me. Jason, I want you to be prepared. Patricia isn't going to take this lying down. She'll probably escalate things. Let her, I said. I've got documentation and witnesses. If she wants to dig herself deeper, that's her choice. Stephen nodded. Fair enough. For what it's worth, you did the neighborhood a favor tonight. Patricia needed to be held accountable. She's been operating like a tyrant for too long. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. The board meeting had gone better than expected. Patricia was off the HOA board, which meant she no longer had any official authority to harass me or anyone else in the neighborhood. Her attempt to bill me had been exposed as fraudulent. My insurance was covering the truck repairs. By any reasonable measure, this should have been over. But as Stephen had warned, Patricia wasn't a reasonable person. The next morning, Friday, I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. It was from a law firm called Morrison and Associates, representing Patricia Hendricks. The letter informed me that I was being sued for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Patricia was seeking $50,000 in damages. I stood on my porch in my pajamas, reading the letter twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. She was actually suing me for telling the truth about her crashing into my truck and trying to bill me for it. The audacity was almost breathtaking. I immediately called Marcus Chen. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding groggy. It's 7 in the morning on a Friday, Jason. This better be good. Patricia is suing me for defamation, I said. I just got served. That woke him up. Seriously, hold on, let me get my glasses. Read me the letter. I read him the entire thing, including the specific claims. Marcus was silent for a long moment after I finished. Okay, he said finally. First, don't panic. This is what we call a SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate you into silence by burying you in legal costs. Second, California has strong anti-SLAPP laws. We can get this dismissed pretty quickly and possibly recover your attorney fees from Patricia. I need a lawyer for this, absolutely. But don't worry, I'll handle it. Consider it a favor to the neighborhood. Patricia's been a menace for years, and someone needs to put a stop to her. I felt another wave of relief. Marcus, I can't ask you to work for free. You're not asking, I'm offering. Besides, this is actually interesting. I do corporate contract law all day. A good old-fashioned SLAPP suit will be fun to crush. Email me a scan of that letter and I'll start drafting our response. True to his word, Marcus took over the legal aspects of the situation. Over the next few weeks, while my truck was being repaired, he filed a motion to dismiss Patricia's lawsuit under California's anti-SLAPP statute. The motion included affidavits from board members and neighbors who'd attended the meeting, the police report, insurance documentation, and copies of the HOA bylaws Patricia had misrepresented. Patricia's attorney, apparently realizing how weak their case was, tried to negotiate a settlement where Patricia would drop the lawsuit if I publicly apologized and paid her $5,000. Marcus responded with a counteroffer. Patricia could withdraw her lawsuit and pay my legal fees of $8,000, or we'd proceed with the anti-SLAPP motion and pursue sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. There was silence from Patricia's side for several days. Then, about 6 weeks after the original accident, Marcus called me with an update. Patricia's withdrawing the lawsuit, he said, sounding pleased. But it gets better. Her attorney is withdrawing as her counsel, citing irreconcilable differences. Reading between the lines, I think he realized she was lying to him about the facts and he doesn't want to risk sanctions. So it's over. Not quite. We're still pursuing attorney fees under the anti-SLAPP statute. The court will likely order Patricia to pay your legal costs, which I'm billing at my standard corporate rate because screw it. She should learn an expensive lesson about filing frivolous lawsuits. How much are we talking? About $12,000 at this point. Could go higher if she fights the fee award, but I doubt she will. Her lawyer probably explained how badly this could go for her if a judge decides to make an example of her. I felt a grim satisfaction at that. Patricia had tried to make me pay $2,000 for damage she caused. Now she was looking at 6 times that amount for trying to abuse the legal system. My truck was returned to me the following week, looking as good as new. The body shop had done excellent work, and Patricia's insurance had covered everything including my rental car expenses. I drove it home and parked it in my driveway, in the exact same spot where Patricia had hit it, with a sense of poetic justice. The neighborhood had noticeably improved since Patricia's removal from the board. The new vice president was a woman named Helen Morrison, a retired librarian who believed in reasonable enforcement of actually important rules and turning a blind eye to trivial matters. Garden gnomes reappeared. Children played outside without fear of noise complaints. The Petersons' son left his bike in the front yard regularly, and nobody cared. About 3 months after the initial accident, I received a notice that the court had granted our motion for attorney fees. Patricia was ordered to pay Marcus $13,800 within 30 days. The judge's order included a stern warning about filing lawsuits in bad faith, and noted that any future similar conduct could result in additional sanctions. Marcus told me that Patricia had actually shown up to the hearing to argue against the fee award. Apparently she'd represented herself since her attorney had withdrawn, and she'd spent 20 minutes ranting about how the HOA had conspired against her, and how I was part of a neighborhood plot to undermine her authority. The judge had listened patiently, then ruled against her anyway. It was kind of sad, honestly, Marcus said. She's clearly convinced herself that she's the victim in all of this. No self-awareness whatsoever. You think she'll actually pay? She doesn't have much choice. If she doesn't, we can garnish her wages or put a lien on her property. I doubt it'll come to that, though. Even Patricia probably realizes she's lost at this point. I didn't see much of Patricia after that. I'd occasionally spot her white Lexus, now repaired, driving through the neighborhood, but she never stopped or made eye contact. According to neighborhood gossip, she'd become somewhat reclusive, rarely attending community events or socializing with neighbors. About 4 months after everything started, Stephen Matthews rang my doorbell on a Saturday afternoon. I answered to find him holding a folder. "Jason, got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, come on in." We sat in my living room and Stephen opened the folder. "I wanted to give you an update on some changes we're making to the HOA bylaws. After the situation with Patricia, the board realized we need better checks and balances to prevent this kind of abuse of authority." He showed me a draft of new regulations that included requirements for board member conduct, clear procedures for issuing violation notices, mandatory review of citations by at least 2 board members before fines could be levied, and a formal appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with enforcement actions. "We're putting these up for a vote at next month's meeting," Stephen said. "I'm hoping you'll support them." "Absolutely. These look great, much more reasonable than what we had before. That's partly thanks to you. If you hadn't stood up to Patricia, we'd probably still be operating under her reign of terror. A lot of people were unhappy, but nobody wanted to be the first to challenge her." After Stephen left, I reflected on how strange the past few months had been. I'd moved to Riverside Meadows looking for a quiet place to live, and instead I'd ended up in a battle with a HOA board member who'd literally crashed into my truck and then tried to make me pay for it. The situation had been absurd from start to finish, but it had also revealed something important about standing up for yourself, even when dealing with someone who seemed to have institutional power. The new HOA bylaws passed overwhelmingly at the next meeting. Helen Morrison proved to be an excellent vice president, and the board functioned much more smoothly without Patricia's constant drama and overreach. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased slightly over the next year, which was ironic given Patricia's constant claims that her strict enforcement was necessary to maintain home values. I did see Patricia one more time in a meaningful way. It was about 8 months after the accident at a local grocery store. We ended up in the same checkout line by coincidence. She was in front of me and I watched her unload her cart: healthy cereals, organic vegetables, expensive cheese. Normal groceries for a normal person, which was jarring given everything that had happened. When she turned and saw me, something flickered across her face. It might have been embarrassment or anger or resignation. I couldn't tell. For a moment I thought she might say something, but instead she just turned back around and focused on her groceries. I thought about saying something, maybe offering some kind of olive branch, but I realized there was nothing to say. Patricia had caused a problem, refused to take responsibility, tried to blame me, attempted to abuse her position, and then sued me when she faced consequences. At no point had she acknowledged any wrongdoing or shown any remorse. Some people simply couldn't admit when they were wrong, and Patricia was clearly one of them. The cashier finished ringing up her groceries and Patricia paid, gathered her bags, and left without looking back. I stepped forward with my own items, feeling oddly melancholy about the whole situation. Life in Riverside Meadows settled into a comfortable routine after that. I became more active in the HOA, attending meetings regularly and even volunteering for the Architectural Review Committee. Turned out that when the HOA was run by reasonable people focused on legitimate issues rather than petty tyranny, it could actually be a positive force in the community. Marcus and I became better friends through the whole ordeal. We started a tradition of having beers on his back porch every couple of weeks, talking about work and life and neighborhood gossip. His wife Lisa would join us sometimes, and we'd laugh about the absurdity of the whole Patricia situation. You know what the craziest part is? Lisa said one evening, about a year after everything started. Patricia actually thought she was the good guy. She genuinely believed she was serving the community. That's what made her so dangerous, Marcus added. Someone who knows they're being unreasonable can at least potentially be reasoned with, but someone who's convinced their own unreasonable behavior is righteous. There's no negotiating with that. I thought about that often in the months that followed. Patricia had been so convinced of her own righteousness that she couldn't see how her actions affected others. She'd turned a simple accident where she was clearly at fault into a months-long ordeal involving police, insurance companies, lawyers, and courts. All because she couldn't admit she'd made a mistake. The final chapter of the saga came about 14 months after the initial accident. I received a check in the mail from Patricia's attorney, actually a different attorney than the one who'd filed the lawsuit. It was for $13,800. The court ordered attorney fees. There was no note, no explanation, just the check. I deposited it and immediately wrote a check to Marcus for the same amount. He'd said he was doing the work as a favor, but I knew he'd spent dozens of hours on my case. When I gave him the check, he initially refused. "Jason, I told you I'd handle this as a favor to the neighborhood." "And you did. But Patricia paid the attorney fees, so now I'm paying my attorney." "Take the check, Marcus. You earned it." He reluctantly accepted, and we had a celebratory beer to mark the official end of the whole mess. I kept my truck parked in my driveway after that, in the same spot where Patricia had hit it. Sometimes I'd look at it and remember the morning she'd crashed into it, the sound of metal crunching, her immediate attempt to blame me for her mistake. It seemed like something from another lifetime, even though it had only been a little over a year. The truck developed some minor mechanical issues eventually, as vehicles do, but the repairs from the accident held up perfectly. Every time I drove it, I felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that Patricia's insurance had paid to fix her mistake, and that her attempt to make me pay for it had backfired so spectacularly. Riverside Meadows thrived under the new HOA leadership. The draconian enforcement disappeared, replaced by reasonable oversight of genuine issues. People actually started attending community events again, no longer worried about Patricia scrutinizing their every move. The neighborhood felt friendlier, more relaxed, more like the community I'd hoped to find when I first moved in. I ran into Stephen Matthews at the community pool one summer day, about 18 months after the accident. We sat in lounge chairs watching kids play in the water while their parents chatted nearby. "You know, I've been president for 4 years now," Stephen said, "and removing Patricia was the single best decision this board has made. We've had 0 complaints about overzealous enforcement since she left. 0. We used to get multiple complaints every week. Has anyone seen her around much? She still lives here, but she keeps to herself mostly. I think the lawsuit thing really embarrassed her, especially having to pay your attorney fees. She tried to come to a board meeting about 6 months ago, during the public comment period, but left before saying anything. Part of me feels bad for her," I admitted. "I mean, she brought everything on herself, but but it must be hard living in a neighborhood where everyone knows you as the person who got removed from the HOA board. Stephen shrugged. She had plenty of opportunities to de-escalate. She could have just apologized after the accident. She could have dropped the fake violation notice. She could have not sued you. At every step, she chose the worst possible option. That's on her, not you. He was right, of course. I'd simply defended myself against someone who was in the wrong. The fact that Patricia had faced consequences for her actions wasn't my fault or my responsibility. The neighborhood moved on. New families moved in, unaware of the drama that had preceded them. The HOA continued functioning smoothly under reasonable leadership. My truck kept running reliably, the repairs holding up perfectly. Life returned to the quiet normalcy I'd originally sought when I bought my house in Riverside Meadows. Sometimes I'd think about that morning, standing in my driveway with a garden hose in my hand, watching in disbelief as Patricia's Lexus slammed into my parked truck. It felt surreal in retrospect, like something that had happened to someone else. But the memory served as a reminder of an important lesson. Standing up for yourself matters, even when it's difficult, even when the other person has some kind of authority, even when it would be easier to just pay whatever they're demanding and move on. Patricia had counted on me backing down, on me being too intimidated or too tired to fight her. She'd probably successfully used that strategy with other homeowners in the past. But she'd miscalculated with me, and it had cost her not just financially but socially and emotionally as well. I never did put warning reflectors on my truck, partly out of principle and partly because they were never required in the first place. My bright red Ford F-150 sat in my driveway, clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look where they were going, a silent testament to the absurdity of the whole situation. 2 years after the accident, I was at a neighborhood barbecue when a new resident named Tom asked me about the truck. Someone had apparently told him the story. "Is that the famous truck?" he asked, pointing at it with his beer bottle. "That's the one," I confirmed. "Man, I heard about that whole situation when we were looking at houses here." The realtor mentioned it as an example of why the HOA was better managed now. Said it used to be run by some crazy lady who crashed into someone's truck and tried to make them pay for it. I laughed. That's a pretty accurate summary. So you're the guy who stood up to her. Dude, you're like a neighborhood legend. Half the reason we bought here was knowing the HOA wasn't going to be nightmare. It was strange to think that my willingness to fight back against Patricia's unreasonable behavior had actually affected the neighborhood's reputation positively. But Tom was right in a way. A HOA is only as good as the people running it, and by holding Patricia accountable, we'd improved the entire community. The barbecue continued into the evening, neighbors chatting and kids playing, the kind of normal suburban scene that would have been impossible during Patricia's tenure. She would have found violations everywhere. Music too loud, kids playing too late, someone's lawn chair being the wrong color. But nobody was looking for violations anymore. We were just people living our lives, enjoying our homes, being reasonable with each other. I spotted Mrs. Chen talking with the Petersons, their son riding his bike in circles nearby. Tim Bradley was manning the grill, arguing good-naturedly with someone about the proper way to cook bratwurst. Marcus and Lisa sat at a picnic table, Lisa laughing at something Marcus had said. Stephen Matthews stood near the pool, talking with Helen Morrison about some upcoming HOA business. It was a community that worked because people were reasonable with each other, because the rules that existed were enforced sensibly, because nobody was looking for petty reasons to exercise authority over their neighbors. Patricia's removal had allowed all of that to flourish. I thought about her sometimes, wondered how she was doing, whether she'd learned anything from the experience. But mostly I just felt grateful that the whole ordeal was over, that my truck had been repaired, that I'd stood my ground, and that the neighborhood was better for it. My bright red Ford F-150 sat in the driveway, no warning reflectors in sight, perfectly visible to anyone who cared to look, just like it had been on that morning 2 years ago when Patricia crashed into it, just like it would remain for as long as I owned it. A reminder that sometimes the most absurd situations can lead to positive change, and that standing up to unreasonable people, no matter how much authority they think they have, is always worth the effort. The sun set over Riverside meadows that evening, casting long shadows across the peaceful streets. Children's laughter echoed from backyards. Dogs barked. Sprinklers hissed on lawns. Normal, everyday sounds of a functioning community where people lived their lives without fear of petty enforcement or manufactured violations. And somewhere in the neighborhood, Patricia Hendricks sat in her house, no longer on the HOA board, no longer able to terrorize residents over garden gnomes and parking spaces. The natural order had been restored, not through my actions alone, but through a community finally standing together against someone who'd abused what little power she had. That, more than anything, was what mattered. Not the money Patricia had to pay, not the satisfaction of winning the legal battle, but the fact that Riverside Meadows was now the kind of place I'd hoped it would be when I first moved in. A community where reasonable people could live their lives in peace, where HOA rules existed to help rather than harass, and where a person could park their truck in their own driveway without worrying about being blamed for someone else's careless driving. The whole experience had taught me something valuable about the importance of documentation, the power of standing up for yourself, and the reality that people with a little authority can sometimes be more tyrannical than those with a lot. Patricia had wielded her vice presidency like a weapon, but in the end, facts and documentation had defeated her attempts at intimidation. I finished my beer at the barbecue and headed home as the evening grew darker. My truck sat waiting in the driveway, gleaming under the streetlight, perfectly repaired and as reliable as ever. I patted the hood as I walked past it, a gesture of affection for the vehicle that had inadvertently sparked a neighborhood revolution. Inside my house, I reflected on how a single morning could change so much. One accident, one woman's refusal to take responsibility, one person's decision to stand up to unreasonable behavior, and suddenly an entire community dynamic shifted. The butterfly effect in action, though with considerably less chaos than usual. Life went on in Riverside Meadows. The HOA functioned properly. Neighbors were friendly. Property values stayed strong. And my truck sat in my driveway, a monument to the absurdity of HOA overreach and the importance of standing your ground against it. Patricia never apologized. She never acknowledged her fault. But in the end, justice had been served not through her remorse but through consequences. Removal from the board, a dismissed lawsuit, attorney fees paid, and a neighborhood that learned the power of standing together against unreasonable authority. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because sometimes you don't get the satisfying conclusion where the villain learns their lesson and changes their ways. Sometimes you just get the satisfaction of knowing you stood up for yourself, that you documented everything, that you didn't back down when someone tried to intimidate you, and that the system, flawed as it might be, eventually worked the way it was supposed to. My truck started reliably every morning. The repairs held up perfectly through rain and sun and the daily commute to work. Patricia's insurance had paid for quality work, and it showed. Every time I drove it, I remembered that morning when she crashed into it, and I smiled at how thoroughly her attempt to blame me had backfired. The neighborhood continued to thrive. More families moved in, attracted by reasonable HOA policies and a genuine sense of community. The homes were well maintained not because of draconian enforcement, but because people took pride in their properties. Gardens flourished with flowers of all heights and colors. Kids played outside without worry. Life was good. And through it all, my bright red Ford F-150 sat in my driveway, exactly where it belonged, visible to anyone with eyes to see, no warning reflectors necessary. A testament to common sense prevailing over petty tyranny, and a reminder that sometimes the most ridiculous situations can lead to the most important changes. Riverside Meadows had learned its lesson. A HOA should serve the community, not rule it. Rules should be reasonable and enforced fairly, not wielded as weapons by petty authoritarians. And when someone does abuse their authority, the community has the power to hold them accountable. Patricia Hendricks had crashed into my truck that morning, but in doing so, she'd accidentally crashed her way out of power. And the neighborhood was infinitely better for it.